The staging area behind the main arena at the Beaumont Regional Rodeo has a particular quality on Saturday mornings. Not the festive energy that fills the stands by midday. Something quieter and more concentrated than that. The smell arrives first, horse and leather and dry Texas earth baked by a sun that has been up for 4 hours already, the faint sharpness of saddle soap and the deeper, older scent of animals that have been worked and rested and worked again. The sound is low and purposeful. Trailers positioned in the numbered slots. Equipment checked and rechecked. Competitors moving with the focused economy of people who have been doing this long enough that preparation requires no announcement. There is a rhythm to this part of the day that exists independent of the crowd that will arrive later, a rhythm that belongs to the competitors and their animals and the specific business of getting ready to do a serious thing seriously. It was a Saturday. It was 10:38 in the morning. The team roping bracket was scheduled for the 2:25 slot. Isaiah Dupree stood at his station in the competitor staging area and ran his hands along the fender of his grandfather's saddle, the way he had done before every event for 32 years. The motion was not nervous. It was not ritualistic in the performed sense. It was the particular kind of physical confirmation that experienced people make before serious work. The verification of everything being in its correct position. The brief communion between a craftsman and the tools of his craft. His fingers found the brass nameplate on the fender without looking for it. 1956. The year his grandfather had had the plate fitted the year before the youngest of his 3 sons was born, the son who would grow up to win the regional team roping championship in 1973, whose photograph faded at the corners and mounted in a frame that had yellowed at the edges. Hung on the wall of the tack room at Dupree Ranch alongside a dozen other photographs, spanning 3 generations of the family's work in this sport. The saddle had been restored 7 years ago. The leather had been carefully stripped and reconditioned by a craftsman in San Antonio who had spent 4 days on the work and refused to charge the full amount when Isaiah told him whose saddle it had been. The brass nameplate had been polished but not replaced. The stitching on the skirt had been redone to match the original pattern thread color, matched as closely as could be managed from materials still in production. It was the saddle his grandfather had used when he rode with the Buffalo Soldiers Cavalry Heritage Preservation Group in the 1950s and 60s, men who kept alive through demonstration and competition and patient historical witness. The memory of the Buffalo Soldiers, the black cavalrymen of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments of the United States Army, who had served in the American West through the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th. Isaiah's grandfather had carried that history on his back and in his hands and had passed it to his son. And his son had passed it down again, and here it was on a staging table in a competitor area in Beaumont, Texas on a Saturday morning in the 2:25 slot. Isaiah's competitor vest was on. His entry number was visible on the front, a laminated card issued at Thursday registration, showing his division, his slot, and his name. His credentials badge was clipped at his collar, issued by the Beaumont Regional Rodeo Organizing Committee. Upon completion of the entry verification process, he had completed at the registration desk 2 days prior. In the breast pocket of his vest was a folded printed confirmation, the registration acknowledgement emailed to him the Tuesday before the event printed. Because Isaiah Dupree had learned over 32 years of competing at rodeos across Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma that documentation is worth carrying even when you do not expect to need it. The official program for the day's events sitting on the staging table beside the saddle showed his name in the team roping bracket, Dupree Isaiah and Dupree DeShawn. 2:25 p.m., Beaumont Regional Rodeo, the 16th consecutive year. He had driven down from Dupree Ranch that morning with DeShawn leaving before 6, the trailer hitched and loaded the night before. The drive was familiar. He had made it 16 times. The route had not changed. The highways ran the same way they always had, and the flat Texas landscape rolled past the windshield the same way, and the sky in the early morning was the specific gray-blue of a Texas dawn that Isaiah associated, without sentiment, with the fact of being on the way somewhere. He had talked with DeShawn about the conditions about the horses, about what he had noticed in DeShawn's practice sessions over the previous 2 weeks. The conversations on these drives were always practical. They were also in the specific way that practical conversations between fathers and sons can be the deepest kind of connection. Everything that needed to be said between them was said in the language of preparation and technique, and the shared understanding of what this event meant. At the adjacent station, DeShawn Dupree was checking his own equipment. 24 years old. The same deliberate hands as his father. He had competed in junior divisions since he was 9 in the intermediate divisions through his late teens and early 20s, and today was his first senior division event. The preparation had been 3 years in the building. 3 years of Isaiah watching his son's technique and adjusting it, watching his timing and refining it, watching him develop the particular combination of instinct and precision that team roping requires from both riders in a partnership where one error undoes everything. DeShawn had been ready for senior division competition for a year. Isaiah had told him so. But Isaiah was not a man who said things like that without meaning them precisely. When he said DeShawn was ready, it meant something specific and measurable, and it meant that this event today at the 2:25 slot was the correct moment and not an approximation of it. DeShawn was quiet. He worked through his equipment checks with focused attention and said nothing. The quiet between them had the quality of a shared understanding that did not require words. That was the nature of what they were to each other. Father and son, and also something beyond that, a relationship built inside a shared discipline over 15 years of training and riding and preparing together on the same patch of land that the Dupree family had worked for decades. The ranch was 22 acres of working land outside Beaumont. It had a main house and a training arena and 4 paddocks and a tack room that smelled of the same combination of leather and saddle soap and horse that the staging area smelled of this morning, which was not a coincidence but a continuity. The smell of the work followed you. That was one of the things Isaiah had said to DeShawn when he was very young. The work follows you when you do it right. You carry it. It becomes part of what you smell like and how you move and how you think. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot do serious work and remain unchanged by it. In the director's box above the main arena, Wyatt Callahan was reviewing the day's roster on his clipboard. 64 years old. He had been organizing the Beaumont Regional Rodeo for 19 years, having taken over from the previous director. In a year when the event was struggling and needed the kind of steady administrative hand that Wyatt had spent his professional life developing. Under his tenure, the event had grown. The purses had increased. The field of competitors had expanded. The reputation of the event within the regional rodeo circuit was that Wyatt ran a tight and fair operation, that if you registered correctly and arrived on time and met the conditions of your entry, you would be treated with the respect that any competitor earned by showing up prepared to compete. Wyatt had known Isaiah Dupree for 16 years. He had watched him compete at this event for 16 consecutive years. He knew the family history not in the distant biographical way that one knows facts about people, but in the specific accumulated way that 19 years of running an event builds up knowledge of the people who make up its fabric. He knew about the grandfather. He knew about the father's 1973 championship. He knew about Dupree Ranch and the training program Isaiah had been running there for 22 years. He knew that when Isaiah entered this event, the entry paperwork would be correct and complete and filed by the deadline, because in 16 years it had always been correct and complete and filed by the deadline. He found the 2:25 slot on his clipboard, Dupree Isaiah and Dupree DeShawn. He noted it confirmed it against the roster he had verified at Thursday registration and moved on to the next item. He had no reason to give that entry a second thought. He had given it the thought it required, which was the confirmatory thought of seeing something that has been true for 16 years, still being true this year. At 10:40 in the morning, Officer Chad Perkins entered the staging area. He was 36 years old. This was his first year working security at the Beaumont Regional Rodeo. He had been assigned to the competitor staging area as part of the event security rotation. Before beginning his patrol, he had received a briefing from the event security coordinator that included the entry badge system, the credentials badges issued to registered competitors. Upon completion of the entry verification process, the entry numbers visible on competitor vests, and the procedure for confirming competitor identity at the various checkpoints along the route from the staging area to the arena floor. The briefing had also included the location of the entry roster, the master list of registered competitors, division by division, maintained by the registration desk, and accessible to any member of the event security team upon request. Perkins had not requested the entry roster before beginning his patrol. He had been briefed on the entry badge system. He had not asked anyone to show him the entry roster before he began his walk through the staging area. He moved through the space with the forward attention of a man who was looking for things rather than learning about them, who was conducting a security function based on what he could observe rather than what he had prepared himself to understand. It is a particular kind of certainty that won. The certainty that comes from having a role and performing it without the full knowledge the role requires. It is also in the specific context of security work, one of the most consequential kinds of error available. He moved through the staging area at 10:40 a.m. and found his way to Isaiah Dupree's station at 10:43. Isaiah heard him before he saw him. The particular sound of official footsteps, deliberate, slightly different in rhythm from the working movement of competitors and crew, registered at the edge of his attention. He did not stop what he was doing. He finished the check he was running on the saddle rigging, verified the tightness of the cinch, and then turned to face the approaching officer with the unhurried attention of a man who has nothing to hide and nowhere to be except exactly where he is. Perkins stopped 2 feet from the station. "This area is restricted. What are you doing here?" It was not quite a question. The phrasing had the compressed quality of commands issued from a specific position, the position of someone who has decided that an explanation is owed to them and is waiting to evaluate it. There was no acknowledgement of the badge at Isaiah's collar. There was no glance at the entry number on the vest. There was nothing in the opening that suggested the officer had approached with the expectation of finding a legitimate competitor. He had approached with the expectation of finding something that needed to be explained. Isaiah looked at him for a moment. The look was level and unrushed. He had been in this position before in various configurations in various contexts across 58 years of living as a black man in America and across 32 years of competing in a sport where black competitors had always been a presence and had not always been made to feel like a welcome one. He recognized the particular architecture of the interaction, the placement of the officer, the phrasing of the challenge, the absence of any opening acknowledgement of the credentials that were visible on his person. He registered all of it, and he processed it with the same deliberate precision he applied to everything else in his life, because the alternative reaction without precision had never served him well, and he had long since decided it never would. He thought briefly of his father, not the photograph on the tackroom wall. The actual man sitting at the kitchen table the morning before Isaiah's first senior division event, a long time ago now. He had said something about how you enter a room matters, not whether you enter it, how. The posture you bring to it, the refusal to compress yourself to fit someone else's idea of what you should be in that space. The willingness to be exactly what you are, credentials and all, and let that be sufficient, because it is sufficient, because it has always been sufficient, because the only thing standing between the sufficiency and its recognition is someone else's error. "I am a registered competitor," Isaiah said. "My credentials are on my person." He touched the badge at his collar. "My entry number is visible on my vest." He indicated the laminated card. "I have a printed confirmation of registration in my breast pocket. I am happy to show you all of it." Perkins looked at this badge, looked at the number on the vest. His expression did not change. Badge and number are not sufficient without dispatch verification. You need to come with me to the perimeter checkpoint. Isaiah did not move immediately. He absorbed the response the way he absorbed most things that came at him from an angle, without recoiling from it, without leaning into it, with the considered attention of someone who needs to understand the full shape of a situation before deciding how to respond to it. This area is the assigned staging area for registered competitors in the 225-team roping bracket, he said. I am a registered competitor in the 225-team roping bracket. My credentials are valid and visible. I have not refused to present them. I have offered them to you. Dispatch verification is required for this area. Come with me. Isaiah reached into his breast pocket and produced the folded confirmation printout. He unfolded it carefully. The paper had been folded and refolded several times over the past 2 days, as he had checked and rechecked it, and the creases were precise, the kind of precise that comes from a habit of order. He held the document out toward Perkins. Perkins looked at it. He did not take it. That document needs to be verified at the checkpoint. A competitor at the adjacent station had been watching. He was white in his mid-40s and wore a competitor vest from the steer wrestling division. He had been coming to this event for 11 years. He had seen Isaiah Dupree competing here for most of those years, had shared staging areas with him on multiple occasions, had watched his son come up through the junior and intermediate divisions, had watched Isaiah instruct and coach and compete with the consistent quality of someone who had been doing this since before many of the people at this event were born. He set down his equipment and walked the 4 steps to where Perkins was standing. That's Isaiah Dupree, he said. He's been coming here since before you were working these events. 16 years at Beaumont. He's in the team roping bracket 225. His credentials are exactly what they should be. I've competed in the same staging area as this man for years. He knows the credential requirements better than most of the security staff does. Perkins turned and looked at him. Thank you for that, he said. The phrasing was civil. The tone was dismissive in the particular way that dismissal can be performed through courtesy. The tone of someone who has received information, filed it in a place where it will have no effect on the current action, and is now returning to the current action. He turned back to Isaiah. I still need you to come with me to the checkpoint. The competitor who had spoken stood for a moment with the specific stillness of a man who has done what he believed was correct and is watching it produce no result. He had given Perkins information, clear information, specific information delivered by a person with direct knowledge and years of personal observation. Perkins had received the information. He had thanked the man who gave it. He had then turned back to continue exactly what he had been doing before the information arrived. He had acknowledged the information. He had thanked the man who gave it. He had not stopped. Isaiah folded the confirmation printout with the same precision he had used when unfolding it. He replaced it in his breast pocket. He looked at his station, the saddle on the table, the equipment checked and prepared and ready, the program on the table with his name in the bracket. He looked at DeShawn 2 stations over, who had gone very still. He turned back to Perkins. He did not say anything more. He had said the things that needed to be said. They were on record in his own memory, and in the memory of the competitor who had spoken, and in the particular accumulation of witnessed moments that constitute a public space. He had conducted himself precisely and without provocation and without retreat. He took 1 step toward the perimeter gate. It was the step of a man who knew that some confrontations are not resolved by being right. They are endured by being undeniable. He would be undeniable. He had been practicing for this his entire life, and his father had practiced before him and his grandfather before that. Perkins had been aware of prior conduct reviews. 3 complaints had been filed against him in the 18 months before this assignment. One from a black competitor at a different rodeo venue, a man who had reported that Perkins had required extended documentation review, while white competitors at the same event were permitted to pass with a brief visual check of their credentials. That complaint had been dismissed. 2 complaints from black attendees at public events, one from a man who had been asked to verify his ticket 4 times, while his white companion was not asked to verify at all, one from a woman who reported that Perkins had questioned her presence in a restricted area she had explicit authorization to be in. Both dismissed. In none of these cases had there been a finding of misconduct. In all of these cases, there had been a pattern. That pattern had followed Perkins into the staging area at 10:40 a.m. and had arrived at Isaiah Dupree's station at 10:43. The perimeter gate was a chain-link section at the east end of the staging area, 8 feet wide, fitted with a security latch. It was visible from 40 feet in any direction. To the north, a section of the temporary spectator stands ran close enough to the staging area boundary that the people in the lower rows had a clear sight line to the gate. Approximately 40 people were seated in that section at 10:46 when Perkins guided Isaiah Dupree toward it. They were seated with the relaxed, anticipatory attention of a crowd that has arrived early for a reason. People who like the preparation phase of an event as much as the event itself, who come to watch the horses and the competitors and the particular energy of the hour before competition starts. The phones came up before the restraints went on, not all of them. 7, then 12, then more. The movement had its own logic. When people in a crowd see something that needs to be documented, the documentation impulse travels faster than understanding. You lift the phone before you know exactly why. The specifics clarify as the recording continues. The restraints went on anyway. They were standard procedure, Perkins would later say, for an individual who had not been cleared through checkpoint verification and who had been directed twice to the checkpoint. The paperwork would say that Isaiah had refused to cooperate with checkpoint protocol. The paperwork was inaccurate. Isaiah had not refused. He had questioned. He had provided documentation. He had asked whether he was being detained. Yes, Perkins had said, pending identity verification. He had then applied the restraints near the chain-link fence where 40 people had a clear view and where by then the phones were already raised. Isaiah felt the restraints settle and he did not resist them. He had decided this before he took the step toward the gate. Resistance was not the point. Resistance would only give the moment a different kind of story, and the story of this moment already had what it needed. 40 witnesses, the phones recording a documented entry roster in the registration office, a competitor who had spoken to Perkins and been thanked and ignored. He stood at the fence with his hands restrained behind him, and he kept his posture. There are things a man carries in his body that cannot be taken by restraints. The posture of 58 years. The posture of a family that had built something across 3 generations in a sport that had not always made space for them and had refused to let that be the deciding fact about their lives. His grandfather had carried himself a specific way. His father had carried himself a specific way. Isaiah had learned the language of that carriage before he understood what it was the language of, and he had been speaking it ever since. He thought about the morning he turned 30 and his father had come to find him in the tack room and had sat on the saddle stand and talked to him for an hour. Not about anything specific. Just talked. About the ranch and the family and the way work makes a man. About what it meant to be the 3rd generation to work this land and this sport. About the brass nameplate and what it stood for and why it mattered that the nameplate was still there. Isaiah had not understood everything his father said that morning. He understood it now. He understood it with the specific clarity of a man standing at a chain-link fence in restraints while his credentials badge hung at his collar and his entry number was pinned to his vest, and the documentation in his pocket said everything that needed to be said. DeShawn saw it from his station. He was 2 stations down. He had watched the conversation. He had watched the competitor who had spoken up the clear statement, the 4 steps it took to make it the specific courage of a man who did not have to say anything and said something anyway. He had watched Perkins thank the man and continue. He had watched his father produce the confirmation and fold it back and take the step toward the gate. and he had felt something move through him that was not entirely fear and not entirely anger, and was something more specific than both the particular anguish of watching someone you love being made to account for themselves in a situation that has no legitimate accounting requirement. The situation was wrong. It was wrong in a way that was visible from where DeShawn stood, visible in the way that wrong things are sometimes visible immediately without explanation to anyone paying attention. He had started walking without deciding to. His body had made the decision before his mind ratified it. He was 3 stations into the walk when his father's eyes found him. Isaiah shook his head once. It was small. It was precise. It communicated everything that needed to be communicated and nothing beyond it. Stop. Stay. I see you. I am not asking for rescue. I am not unaware of where I am. What is happening here is being handled by being witnessed, not by being contested in the moment. That distinction matters. Trust that. Trust me. DeShawn stopped. He stood in the staging area between his station and the perimeter gate, and he stood very still. 24 years old in his competitor vest in the first senior division event of his career, watching his father in restraints at a chain-link fence while 40 people in the stands recorded it on their phones. He understood his father's instruction. He did not like it, but he understood it, and understanding it was a form of honoring it, and honoring it was a form of trust. And trust between these 2 men had been built over 24 years and required nothing beyond itself. There are moments in a person's life that settle into the permanent architecture of how they understand the world. Not the dramatic moments necessarily, not the victories or the named events. Sometimes the moments that shape you most are the ones where you are required to stand still when your body wants to move, to trust a process when the process is failing you, to believe in a discipline that was given to you by people who had more cause than you to disbelieve it and chose to believe it anyway. This was one of those moments. DeShawn would carry it for the rest of his life. The look in his father's eyes at the chain-link fence, the single small movement of the head, the instruction to hold still and trust the process even when the process was this. Especially when the process was this. The public address system came on at 10:49. The voice was bright and practiced the voice of a professional announcer who had been introducing competitors at this event for 11 years. He had a specific relationship to the rhythm of an event like this, a trained ear for when the crowd needed lifting and when it needed settling. He had not been monitoring the situation at the perimeter gate. He was working from the run-of-show sheet, calling the introductions in sequence, fulfilling the promotional function of the public address work. The announcement filled the arena at full volume. It reached the stands and the staging area and the perimeter gate and the 40 people with their phones raised and the competitors at their stations and DeShawn where he stood and Chad Perkins at the chain-link fence. Now, entering the team roping bracket, the announcer said out of Dupree Ranch, 16-year Beaumont Regional competitor Isaiah Dupree and son. 16,000 people heard it. 16,000 people in the stands and at the concessions and in the aisles and in the corridors heard the name of the man who was standing in restraints at a perimeter gate while a first-year security officer decided whether to believe what was written on the man's credentials. They heard it in the same moment that approximately 40 of them with a direct sightline to the gate were already watching it happen. The announcement and the sight arrived in those 40 people simultaneously, the name and the image landing together, and the combination of them had an effect that traveled in both directions back through the stands where 16,000 more people were hearing the name without the image and outward through the phones that were already recording toward every network and platform and contact list that 40 people could reach. DeShawn heard his own name announced alongside his father's and felt it land in his chest with the particular weight of something that has been earned and is now being taken from you while you watch. 3 years of preparation. His name in the air over a Beaumont Regional Rodeo audience of 16,000 people, called from the same public address system that had called his grandfather's name in demonstration events decades before. called alongside his father's name in the bracket his family had competed in for 16 consecutive years. Called while his father stood restrained at a chain-link fence. He did not move. He honored the instruction in the single small headshake, but he did not look away. Perkins' supervisor arrived at the gate at 10:52. He had been notified by radio. He assessed the situation at the gate, confirmed with Perkins that the identity verification process was ongoing, confirmed that dispatch had not yet returned a clearance, and told the small group of watching competitors and crew that the checkpoint procedure was standard protocol and that the situation would be resolved through proper channels. He spoke with the calibrated tone of a man performing the management function, a tone designed to signal control of a situation that was by that point being recorded by multiple phones and observed by an expanding crowd. Isaiah was not released. The supervisor had assessed the situation and had found it procedurally defensible. He had not checked the entry roster. He had not walked 20 feet to the staging table to look at the saddle. He had seen a man in restraints at a perimeter gate and an officer conducting a checkpoint procedure, and he had evaluated it in the framework of security protocols rather than in the framework of what was actually happening. His support of the procedure was not malicious. It was the quieter kind of error, the one that comes from evaluating a situation entirely within the system that produced it without asking whether the system was being applied correctly in the first place. The crowd at the fence had grown. More phones, more faces turned toward the gate. Competitors who had been working at their stations had drifted slightly in the direction of the activity, not enough to interfere enough to witness. The staging area had the particular tightened quality of a space where something is happening that should not be happening, where the normal activity of the day has gone still in the vicinity of an event that everyone present can see is wrong. DeShawn had not moved from the place where he stopped when his father shook his head. He stood there, and he watched. He had been 3 years preparing for this event. He had trained under his father's instruction since he was 9 years old. He had gotten up before 6 that morning and loaded the trailer and made the drive down in the dark and arrived at this staging area and gone through his equipment checks, and he was ready. He was completely, precisely 3 years built. Ready. And his father was at a chain-link fence in Restraints, while his name echoed away into the morning air and the crowd at the fence grew and the phones kept recording. He thought about the first time he had ridden beside his father in a competition setting. He had been 11. Junior Division small event outside Houston. He had been so focused on technique, every form point his father had drilled into him for 2 years present in his body, like a checklist that he had not understood until after the run, that the crowd had been watching and had made a sound, and that the sound had been for them. His father had said after the work always gets seen eventually. You do the work. The crowd finds it. DeShawn had remembered that sentence at intervals throughout his life, and he was remembering it now standing in a staging area watching his father seated on a folding chair inside a gate that should not be closed in the specific way that things you were taught in childhood come back to you when the situation most requires them. The crowd at the fence was larger now than it had been when the phones first came up. Word had moved through the staging area and into the lower sections of the stands and across the arena in the particular way that news of something wrong moves through a crowd faster than official communication carried by observation and brief exchange building as it travels. People who had heard the announcement at 10:49 and had been following it with the attention of people who have put together a sequence of events were still watching. On the staging table, 20 feet from where Perkins stood at the gate, there was a saddle with a brass nameplate on the fender. The nameplate read the family name and the year 1956. Perkins had entered the staging area at 10:40 a.m. He had walked the length of it before arriving at Isaiah's station. He had walked past the staging table on his way to the perimeter gate. He had been at the gate for 9 minutes. He had walked past the saddle twice. The clock at the registration desk read 10:55 when DeShawn looked at it from his position in the staging area. The team roping bracket deadline for entry into the starting box was 11:14. That was 19 minutes. If Isaiah was not at the competitor entrance with his horse by 11:14, the entry would be forfeited. The event record would show a no-show for the 2:25 slot. DeShawn would not compete. 3 years of preparation and the first senior division event of his career and his father's 16th consecutive year at Beaumont Regional forfeited because a first-year security officer had not looked at the entry roster before beginning his patrol. DeShawn had the kind of mind that under pressure looks for every possible variable before concluding that a situation is closed. He had learned it from his father, who had it from his own father, and who had drilled it into DeShawn during every training session at the ranch. You do not declare a run over until it is actually over. There is always one more thing you can try. The variable you have not identified is more important than the ones you have. He attempted to reach the registration desk. He was told by a crew member near the entrance that the desk was closed during the event period for administrative processing, and that no override authority was available at the checkpoint location. He attempted to reach the event security coordinator, directly the person who had briefed Perkins, who would know the full credential system and the proper procedure for resolving a documentation dispute. He was directed to a radio channel that was busy with the event's operational communications and got no answer. He did not have his father's attorney's number saved correctly in his phone. The number he had was a work number that did not route to a voicemail on weekends. He stood in the staging area with his phone in his hand and the clock moving and his father at the gate and the deadline 19 minutes away. And he thought with the careful clarity of someone who has been trained to think clearly under pressure about what options remained. There were not many. He walked back to his position and he waited. His father could see him from the gate. Isaiah was seated now on a folding chair that someone had brought inside the perimeter. His hands no longer in active restraints, but the gate still closed and the supervisor still present and no clearance issued. The restraints had been removed once the supervisor confirmed that the individual was cooperating, a modification that acknowledged nothing wrong with having applied them in the first place, and nothing wrong with the situation that had produced them. Isaiah sat with his hands in his lap. His posture was the same. He was looking at the arena floor through the fence slats. You could see the arena floor from the gate. You could see the starting box from the gate, the specific wooden structure at the head of the track where the team roping event would begin, where competitors entered with their horses and waited for the signal and began the precise, practiced sequence of a run that took seconds to execute and years to prepare. Isaiah had entered that starting box from this gate 16 times. He could see it from the folding chair inside the perimeter, and he looked at it, and he thought about it the way people think about things they can see and cannot reach. Not with despair. With the particular patience of someone who intends to reach them. He looked up from the arena floor and found DeShawn where he stood. They looked at each other across the distance of the staging area. Father and son separated by 40 feet of ground and one closed gate and the full weight of what the morning had been. Isaiah gave DeShawn a single small nod, not the headshake of before. Different. This was an affirmation rather than an instruction. Something that said, I see where we are, and I know what this is, and I am not broken by it. Not because the morning had been anything other than what it was. Not because restraints at a chain-link fence are a small thing or because 19 minutes to a deadline is not a real clock. But because there are things that a man knows from the inside of a history, from the accumulated inheritance of people who have been told no in various configurations across a very long time and have refused to let the telling be the end of the story. The nod said that. It said 3 generations before this morning and 3 generations after it. It said the brass nameplate and the tack room photograph and the 1973 championship and the ranch that was still there and always would be. It said that whatever happened in the next 19 minutes, it was not enough to erase what had been built. DeShawn stood straighter. At the gate, Perkins was writing in his incident notebook. His pen moved with the confidence of a man who had concluded that he was in the right. Refused to cooperate with checkpoint protocol, he wrote. Identification, verification, pending. The phrasing had the careful procedural quality of notes written by someone constructing a record rather than describing an event. The word refused was doing a great deal of work in those notes. Isaiah had not refused. He had questioned and offered documentation and asked whether he was being detained, and then walked when told to walk. None of those things were refusal. The word refused was a different kind of thing. It was the architecture of a justification built after the action it was supposed to justify. Perkins was comfortable. That was the most striking quality about him in those minutes at the gate. He was not uncertain. He was not defensive in the way that people become defensive when they can feel the weight of a mistake accumulating around them. He was not aware of the phones, or aware of them in the way that required him to reconsider anything. He was comfortable with the certainty that he had done the correct thing. It was the wrong kind of certainty, the kind that does not examine itself because it has not been built to the kind that experience and curiosity and honest encounter with consequences might eventually erode, but that on a Saturday morning at 10:55 was fully intact and holding. He wrote his notes. He waited for dispatch. He had not checked the roster. He did not check it now. 11:02, 12 minutes to the deadline. Wyatt Callahan had been in the director's box when the announcement went out at 10:49. He had heard his own public address system announce a competitor who was, by what the staging monitor showed him, not at the competitor entrance preparing to enter. He had looked at the staging monitor and then at the roster on his clipboard and then at the monitor again. He had seen the cluster at the perimeter gate on the secondary camera feed. The officer, the supervisor, the man in the folding chair, the crowd at the fence, the phones. He had seen DeShawn in the staging area, standing alone at his station. He had looked at the time on the clock above the monitor and at the deadline in the run-of-show schedule. He set down his clipboard. He had run this event for 19 years. He had seen various things go wrong in those 19 years. The kinds of things that go wrong in a large outdoor event with hundreds of competitors and thousands of attendees, and the full complexity of a live production that cannot be paused or revised. He had responded to those situations with the measured, decisive quality of someone who understands that authority is not loudness, but clarity. That the most effective response to a situation in crisis is the calm, correct action taken at the correct moment. This was a situation in crisis. It was 11:02. It was 12 minutes to the deadline. A man he had known for 16 years was in a folding chair inside a perimeter gate, while a first-year security officer wrote notes and waited for a verification that should never have been necessary. He came down from the director's box with deliberate, weighted authority. Not quickly, not with the urgent scramble of panic, but with the specific gravity of someone who has decided something and is moving to execute it. He did not radio ahead. He did not send a deputy. He did not create the kind of institutional remove between himself and the problem that would allow the problem to persist until the process resolved it. He walked directly to the perimeter gate with 19 years of Beaumont Regional behind him, and the roster he knew by heart, and the full knowledge of what he was going to say when he got there. He arrived at the gate at 11:03, 11 minutes to deadline. He looked at Perkins. He looked at the supervisor. He looked at Isaiah in the folding chair, hands in his lap posture exact. He did not ask Perkins a question. He made a statement. "This is Isaiah Dupree," Wyatt said. He spoke in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to the acoustics of large outdoor venues, a voice shaped by 19 years of addressing crowds and competitors and staff in spaces where you needed to be heard clearly and without ambiguity. The voice reached the 40 people at the fence and the competitors in the staging area and DeShawn at his station and the supervisor beside the gate and Perkins with his notebook open in his hand. "This is Isaiah Dupree. He is a 16-year competitor at this event. His entry credentials are valid and verified. His name is on the roster. His entry was registered Thursday at the main desk. I personally verified it. I have verified it every year for 16 years. He is in the 225 team roping bracket. He belongs in this staging area. He belongs at that competitor entrance. He belongs in that arena. He paused for a single beat. The pause had the quality of a period, a full stop, an unambiguous ending to the statement of what was true. He did not look at Perkins again after that. He walked to the staging table. The saddle was there exactly where Isaiah had left it, exactly as it had been when Perkins walked past it twice without stopping. Wyatt picked it up with both hands. It was not a light saddle, restored leather, solid hardware, a century of use compressed into a well-made thing that had been maintained with the attention it deserved. He lifted it and turned to face the section of the temporary stands at the fence. He held it up. The brass nameplate caught the morning light. 1956. The year. The name. Wyatt held the saddle at chest height, facing the crowd, and said nothing further. The saddle said what needed to be said. He was holding up an argument. He was holding up a history. He was holding up the specific, tangible, undeniable evidence of 3 generations of a family in this sport. Evidence that had been sitting on a table 20 feet from where all of this was happening for the past 23 minutes. The people in the stands knew what they were looking at. Some of them knew the family history, specifically had watched Isaiah compete, had heard the Dupree name over many years of events, understood the significance of the saddle and the brass nameplate and the restoration work and what it represented. Some of them had never seen Isaiah Dupree before this Saturday, and would have been unable to explain precisely why the side of that saddle held up by the event director was moving something in them, why there was a pressure in the chest that came with looking at it, a quality of recognition that preceded full understanding. But it was moving something. The truth had a shape in that moment. It was a restored leather saddle with a brass nameplate on the fender held up in the morning light by a man who had known exactly whose it was for 16 years, and who was holding it up because it was the clearest statement available of what had been missed, what had been overlooked, what had been visible the entire time and had not been seen. The crowd recognized it the way crowds sometimes recognize things that have been made undeniable. The cheer started at the fence. It was not the orchestrated cheer of a crowd responding to a scheduled announcement. It was not the specific athletic cheer of a crowd responding to a good run or a close time. It was the sound of people who have witnessed an injustice being corrected. A sound that starts somewhere in the body before it reaches the voice, that carries a quality of release in it, of something being set right after being wrong. It started with the 40 at the fence who had been watching and recording, and who had the most complete understanding of what was happening, and it moved back through the rows and across the temporary stands and through the corridors into the main arena, and it built as it moved because the arena had been carrying the particular tension of a space where something is wrong, and now the tension was releasing, and was 16,000 people. The sound filled the Beaumont Regional Rodeo arena at 11:04 on a Saturday morning in a way that Wyatt Callahan, 19 years directing the event, would later say he had never heard before and would be unlikely to hear again. It was not the cheer of entertainment or competition. It was the specific acoustic signature of a crowd that has been shown the truth at the moment that the truth most needed showing, and has responded to it with the full force of what a crowd of 16,000 people can produce when every voice in it is saying the same thing. There is a particular moment in the arc of a crowd's response when the sound peaks, and then just before it continues, drops into a near silence. Not quiet, but changed a beat between the height of the cheer and what comes after it. That beat arrived at 11:04, and in it, Chad Perkins stood at the gate with his hands at his sides, and the notebook still open in one hand, and the pen in the other, and 16,000 people having heard and seen everything. The crowd had not quieted, but it had changed. It knew something now that could not be unknown. Perkins stood in the knowledge of 16,000 people, and the knowledge had a particular weight to it. The weight of being seen, of having every decision and every notation and every step of the past 23 minutes illuminated in the specific clarity that comes when the context becomes complete. The supervisor overruled him at 11:05. The decision to release Isaiah Dupree was not accompanied by any speech from Perkins. He did not retract the word "refused" from his notebook. He stepped back from the gate. The supervisor made the procedural statement that the identity verification had been resolved and that the competitor was free to proceed. Isaiah rose from the folding chair with the unhurried movement of a man who has been waiting for something that was always going to arrive, that was never actually in question, that required only the right person to confirm what was already true. Wyatt brought the saddle to him. Isaiah took it without a word. He held it the way you hold something that belongs to you, not with ceremony, not with demonstration, but with the complete ease of familiarity. Hands going to the correct positions. Automatically, weight distributed the way a person distributes the weight of something they have carried for a long time. He looked at Wyatt for a moment. Something passed between them that did not require language and would not have been served by it. Wyatt nodded once. Isaiah turned. He walked to where DeShawn was standing. DeShawn had watched all of it. He had watched Wyatt come down from the director's box. He had watched the statement made at the gate and the supervisor's position change and the gate come open. He had watched the saddle held up and the crowd move through the stands like something released. He had watched his father rise from the chair. Now his father was walking toward him across the staging area with the saddle in his arms and 8 minutes to the deadline and the crowd still going. Isaiah reached him and they stood together for a moment. Not long. There was no time for long. "Let's go," Isaiah said. They entered the arena floor together at 11:06. 4 minutes to the deadline. The competitor entrance was clear. Their horses were ready handed to them by the crew who had been waiting since 11, with the patient readiness of people who trust that the thing they are waiting for will arrive. Isaiah mounted with the fluid certainty of a man who has been doing this for 3 decades, and whose body carries the knowledge independently of anything else that might be happening around it. DeShawn mounted beside him. They moved to the starting position. When the announcer called their names again for the event start, the crowd's response was unlike anything heard at this rodeo in 19 years. Wyatt Callahan, standing in the director's box with his roster on his clipboard, would say so afterward to several people. He would say it quietly with the particular restraint of a man who has seen something he wants to describe accurately and knows that the most accurate description is sometimes also the simplest one. He had never heard anything like it. Not in 19 years. The suspension notice reached Chad Perkins by Monday morning. Pending conduct review, it said. The prior complaints, the dismissed complaint from the competitor at another venue, the 2 dismissed complaints from attendees at public events were referenced as part of the review record. The review would examine the Saturday incident in full. The entry roster, the credential system, the timeline of the event from 10:40 to 11:05, the incident notes, and the specific language Perkins had used in those notes would all be part of the review. The word "refused" received particular attention. The review was thorough. It took several weeks. At the end of it, Perkins was terminated. The pattern of complaints across the 18 months of his tenure, considered alongside the Saturday incident and the specific inaccuracies in his incident notes, and the full timeline as reconstructed from the security camera footage and the multiple phone recordings submitted by event attendees, constituted sufficient grounds. The review board's finding described specific actions, specific failures, and specific consequences, one following from another, with the clarity of a sequence that had a beginning and had now arrived at its end. The Beaumont Regional Rodeo's formal written apology was issued the following Monday. It was specific in the way that good apologies are specific, naming what had happened, naming who it had happened to, acknowledging what had been wrong and what had been failed. It included the entry credential log from Thursday registration, showing the exact timestamp of Isaiah Dupree's entry verification, 3:47 p.m., 2 days before the event, processed by the main registration desk, confirmed by the event director. It acknowledged that a registered competitor with 16 consecutive years of participation at the event had been detained and restrained during a security action that had not followed the event's own procedures for credential verification. It named Isaiah Dupree by name. It apologized without qualification. Isaiah received the apology at Dupree Ranch on a Tuesday. He read it carefully, the way he read everything, giving it the attention of someone who has learned that documents say specific things and that specific things matter. He noted what it said and what it acknowledged and what it committed to. He folded it and placed it in the drawer of his desk in the office that adjoined the tack room, the desk that his father had used before him and his grandfather before that, a desk that held a long accumulation of documents and records and the specific paper trail of a life built in a field that required documentation. The photograph on the wall was still there. His father in 1973, regional champion, the expression of a man who had earned something through the specific discipline of being undeniable over time. Isaiah looked at it for a moment and then went back to his day. DeShawn competed in his first senior division event on that Saturday afternoon in the 225 slot, the slot that had been reserved since Thursday registration, the slot that had very nearly been forfeited, the slot that existed because 16 years of entries had preceded it, and because Wyatt Callahan had known Isaiah Dupree long enough to come down from a director's box with 11 minutes to a deadline and say what needed to be said. The time was posted while the crowd was still in their seats, still present with the full awareness of what the morning had been and what the afternoon's competition meant in the context of it. Whatever the time was, and it was good, the clean result of 2 riders who had prepared for 3 years and who rode with the quality that comes from having something to prove and choosing to prove it with precision rather than with noise, the crowd responded. They responded the way a crowd responds when it has witnessed something and wants the witnessing to matter. The arena stayed loud. The sound did not have the quality of entertainment. It had the quality of confirmation. Wyatt Callahan noted the time in his record book in the director's box. He noted the crowd response in the column he kept for observations about the event. His entry for that day's team roping bracket read, Dupree, Isaiah, and DeShawn. First senior division for DeShawn Dupree. Crowd response exceptional. Warranted. He underlined the last word. It was unlike him to underline. He left it. After the event in the staging area, as the afternoon wound down and trailers were being loaded and equipment was being checked for the drive back, Isaiah polished the brass nameplate on his grandfather's saddle. It was something he always did after competing on it. The polishing cloth he kept in the side pocket of the equipment bag was soft and slightly darkened from years of use. He worked the brass in small circles the way his grandfather had shown his father, and his father had shown him. The nameplate had earned its shine through decades of the same motion, the same care, the specific practice of taking something that mattered and keeping it in the condition it deserved. He polished it twice that Saturday. DeShawn watched him from where he was loading the second horse into the trailer. He watched without saying anything. He understood what the second pass meant. He was 24 years old, and he was learning in the ongoing way that learning of the important kind never actually stops the particular vocabulary of how a man carries what he has been through without being made smaller by it. The acts of maintenance and ritual and deliberate care that are not about the object being maintained, but about the person doing the maintaining. About returning to the work. About refusing in the specific daily unglamorous way that refusing actually happens to be diminished. There is something that a name announces when it is called in a place where that name has been built over 16 years, and before that, over a father's career, and before that, over a grandfather's service, and the history he carried, and the saddle he rode, and the brass nameplate that still says what it has always said. It announces not just a person, but the full weight of what has been accumulated. The choices made, the mornings entered the years, given over to something that required everything and gave back something that cannot be taken in restraints at a chain-link fence, no matter how long the morning runs or how wrong the notes say. Isaiah Dupree's name was announced twice in the same hour at the Beaumont Regional Rodeo on a Saturday in the 2:25 slot, the 16th consecutive year. The first time, 16,000 people heard it while watching the restraints. The second time, they were already standing. The weight of a name is the weight of everyone who ever carried it. It does not diminish with difficulty. In the right conditions, before the right crowd, with a brass nameplate catching the morning light, and a man holding it up who has known whose it is for 16 years, the weight only increases. Heavier in the way that matters. Heavier in the way that holds. Heavier in the way that 3 generations of a family learned one after another is the only kind of weight worth carrying. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one. Stories where what was built across 3 generations could not be erased by one morning at a gate. Stories where a crowd knew the truth before anyone explained it, and where dignity carried exactly the weight it was given. Stories about people who polished the nameplate twice, who drove down before 6 in the morning and came back the following year, who gave the work everything it required and refused to let anyone decide what that was worth. Subscribe and stay